Greetings everybody, I'm the Spirit Guy and welcome to Spirit Guy Ed, where hopefully today I can be your spirit guide, give you fuel for thought, answer some unfulfilled questions, further your understandings or inspire you. And welcome to the second series on this channel. In the last series we explained what God is and the metaphysics of the foundations of the universe. If you haven't watched it yet, I advise you do so because it will help you make better sense of this series. The last series and this one are the two crucial series, the two must-watches, the prerequisites to understanding and making sense of all the other videos on this channel. And like I said in the last series, once both these series are complete, I will then be able to move on to a range of other topics that aren't so technical as the last one. Although do note that this series here is not as heavy as the last one, as we're not going into depths of metaphysics, but are going to go through how everything we learnt in the last series applies to you and your life and your existence. Before we get started, this is important to keep in mind when watching any of my videos. The main point to this channel and these videos is to encourage the discussion of ideas. These are my beliefs, views, ideas, and understandings. I hope they inspire you to deeper thinking and to discuss your ideas with others, and hopefully help you with your spiritual progress. Different opinions, ideas, and constructive criticism or opposition is welcome. Everyone is welcome to their opinions here. These ideas or knowledge are not new. They have been around and evolved throughout human history, nor are these of my own personal making. I've learnt most of them from others, and personal study I should add, so I'm not some special enlightened soul or prophet or anything like that. I'm just someone that has been educated on these matters, a pupil of great teachers. So, our layers of mind and consciousness. Spoiler, there are 3. And if you haven't connected the dots, the design of my logo is kind of representative. In this video, like the first one in the last series, we'll do an overview with a bit of information on each topic. Then later videos will go into depth and put it all together or help make sense of something. I'll bring this up now and talk about it a bit now because we, us humans, have an individuality, an individual consciousness, an individual sense of I, and so an individual ego. It is separate from the ego of God, although the ego of God is the original and foundation of our I. In a technical sense, it is impossible to separate from God, as the last video made clear, as God is the very process that is and which makes everything. The aspect of mind is the foundation of everything. But in consciousness, which consists of opposites, greater and lesser, condition or degrees of awareness and separation from the source, it is possible to separate from God. It is possible to separate in consciousness from the ego of God, to separate in degrees of awareness from God. Even though God is still the foundation and basis of existence, an individual consciousness can be consciously oblivious to it. Consciousness and what it is exactly, how it works and how it comes to be, we went through in depth in the last series. The result of consciousness is manifestation or awareness, and specifically self-awareness or the awareness of I. God can only know itself through creation or manifestation of its power, which is consciousness. And the source of or the energy supply of consciousness is mind, or nothingness, emptiness, the unmanifest, pure potentiality, pure potential energy, which is egoless or has no I. Consciousness is God's understanding of self or I, as it is also ours, as we, humans, have a high level of sentience, and so we have a strong established sense of I or self, or individuality, which means we have an individual consciousness, or our own ego. Ego is Latin for I, and by dictionary definitions refers to the I or self of any person, a thinking, feeling, and conscious being able to distinguish itself from other selves and the world, your consciousness of your own identity, your idea or opinion of yourself, especially your thoughts and feelings of your own importance and ability, or in philosophy, the enduring and conscious element that knows experience, or in scholasticism, the complete person comprising both body and soul. My definition is basically the same, just more spiritual based. The ego is the soul's understanding of self. The ego is the way a person perceives self and others and all of its experiences. The ego is the earth mind, both conscious and subconscious mostly, which will experience life through its perceptions and senses, as well as its own set of references according to its spiritual development. That's key to remember. We have a very strong sense of I, and this strong sense of I creates a very big problem, but simultaneously is also what gives us the means for the greatest of spiritual development. On an intellectual level, and eventually a realization like all this stuff, although the full realization of what we're about to discuss right now is of the uttermost difficulty, and is accomplished with spiritual enlightenment. Buddhism heavily discusses the concept of emptiness or mind, and how it relates to the ego or the sense of I, or consciousness, the manifestation of everything. It's explaining God, like we did in the last series. Although I must say the writers or editors of this Buddhist teaching gooped it up with overcomplicated words and complexity. Some of it, when you read it, it's like someone trying to sound smart by using difficult words and making something that's already challenging even more complicated than it needs to be. But anyway, this guy on screen, Nagarjuna, heavily elaborated and expanded on the concept of emptiness that was originally laid down in the teachings of Siddhartha. In a speedy nutshell way of how they explain this concept, start with the question of where is the thing that you call I, or where is the you exactly? Point out where it is. Hint, you can't, because the you or I is dynamic, meaning dependent on its multitude of factors in order to exist. So there is no abiding self. When your body hurts, you say, my body, or a specific part of your body. Yet point out where you are in your body. Is your body not you? When your thoughts or emotions are moving all over the place, you say, what's my mind doing? Yet where is the you or the I that is referring to and saying, my body, my thoughts and emotions, along with my experience and my consciousness? It's not that there is no I or self, it just doesn't exist of its own accord. It's not an ultimate reality. In consciousness, everything is relative reality, and the I is a relative reality as it's dependent on all its multitude of factors being in place. I exists because all the factors which make up you, or your sense of I, are in place to do so. All the factors are interdependent. And keep expanding on that and you'll realize the entire universe is interdependent to manifest. Take an example of a table. This is a table, yet where is the table exactly? We can take apart each of its legs and the top and then examine a single fiber of its wood and where it came from. Well, now the concept of the table has disappeared entirely. You can then ask where is the fiber of wood exactly, and just keep going. A table is only a table under the conditions and factors which make and regard it as a table. The concept of self or I, or consciousness, all of consciousness, works in the same way. And all the factors are constantly changing, as does the I, or the concept of I. You are not the same you as you were 10 years ago. You will not be as you are now 10 years from now. The concept of I is ever changing and evolving, because consciousness is activity and constantly in motion, constantly changing. The ultimate reality is emptiness or mind, which is what gives rise to everything. The I is part of the unreality or illusions projected by the mind, made from the desire of mind to understand its reality. It's lovely to intellectually or conceptually lay that out, but to actually realize it and live in accordance with this truth takes a lot of effort and spiritual advancement, as the ignorance of the I, or ego, is so strong, limited, and blinding. To overcome it is the spiritual task of the human soul, and the most difficult thing in the universe to accomplish. Our mind is layered, and it is possible to distinguish it into three predominant layers. 3 layers of mind and consciousness. The God conscious, the subconscious, and the conscious or earth conscious. They are layers because they are the one. They form your soul. They are your I. They cannot exist separately. From the top down, they separate and give rise to each other, but they can have limited awareness of each other. And here on screen, I have symbolically represented each layer and stated how big, quantity-wise, each layer is, and its level of awareness of God or the ultimate reality. So, the God-conscious layer is actually super tiny, but fully aware of God. The subconscious layer is the biggest, and it has some degree of awareness, and the earth-conscious layer, well, it's not nearly as small as the God-conscious layer, but compared to the subconscious layer, it is small, and its awareness is as it's far removed from the source, and so very limited and ignorant, and so its illusions seem very real or the only reality to it. As we'll discuss, the conscious or the earth-conscious mind seems, sees, and thinks it is the biggest and most aware, and that its reality is the ultimate. But first, let's go through each layer in order. First up, the God-conscious mind. Well, God-conscious is pretty self-explanatory. This is, in terms of quantity, the smallest layer, but it is the most powerful layer. It is the soul's original state of consciousness. It is the original that expanded and gave rise to the other layers. It is their foundation, and is the base of the subconscious mind, which means its thoughts filter into the subconscious mind. You could call this our higher mind, as it is and is linked to the mind and consciousness of God itself. God consciousness is universal soul, the highest self, divine ego. In other words, God's soul as the manifestation of all that exists. It's the promised land, the kingdom of heaven, nirvana, and so on. The highest level of intelligence is God consciousness, or Buddha nature, or Atman Brahma, which comes from the heart of the soul as the pure divine intelligence of mind. This is the soul's divine state of consciousness, God consciousness or universal consciousness, which is aware of the aspects of itself that exist as though they are separate from the divine source of all energy, which are the subconscious and conscious layers. And so the human soul has an innate desire, which we'll talk about later, to make itself whole again by reunifying all aspects of itself within the one source of all being, which is pure mind or God, because this is where it originates from. Every human soul is lost, or has been lost if they've attained enlightenment already, caused by a lack in knowledge of God in their lower ego state of consciousness. Every human soul consciously or subconsciously searches for the promised land, which is God consciousness. Heaven is the higher consciousness of our God conscious layer of mind, or of our soul. A very high degree of God consciousness is needed to attain enlightenment and to complete our task here on earth. The God conscious layer of mind is always above that of the soul's conscious and subconscious layers. The God conscious layer of mind contains the thoughts related to perfect love. It is the soul's state of void or non-manifestation. The God-conscious mind is the seat of the soul's divinity. The God-conscious mind is conscious of the divine essence within the soul. It knows that it is God. From these thoughts, choices are then also made as to the wisest course to take in any situation or circumstance. Next up, the subconscious mind. The subconscious mind is the largest in quantity and the second most aware of God, but it is not nearly as powerful or as aware as the God-conscious mind. This is the layer of mind which you can most accurately refer to as your soul or your individuality. This layer has in memory all the experiences you've had since you became a separate individual consciousness or individual soul. It is the soul's experience and the consciousness that has developed from these experiences within spiritual and physical matter. Every experience the soul has within matter is recorded within this layer of mind. It doesn't forget. This layer of consciousness can often be at odds with the other two layers as it receives thoughts from both layers. There can be times where the conscious layer is calling to the subconscious layer to bring God-conscious thoughts through, but the subconscious layer is struggling with fear, and so it is blocking or not allowing them to enter or pass. And then there can be times where the God-conscious layer is trying to send thoughts to. It can actually be either layer, but for argument's sake, is trying to send thoughts to the conscious layer, but the conscious layer just isn't having it and blocking it, so it doesn't go into the subconscious and then into the conscious layer. Many, many battles are fought within the subconscious mind, but also keep in mind that there are battles fought at each and on all layers of mind. Many people fail to appreciate or comprehend the real importance and impact of their subconscious. Because it is not apparent to the conscious mind, people tend to think it isn't of much importance and easily dismiss it. Because the conscious mind dominates when the soul is awake to the earth plane of existence, it is easy to fail to recognize the thoughts that are within its subconscious layer and God-conscious layer. The subconscious is the base of the earth conscious mind, meaning it filters its thoughts into the conscious mind. And remember, the God-conscious mind filters its thoughts into the subconscious. And so, only through the subconscious can the conscious mind receive God-conscious thoughts. The subconscious layer of mind is closely associated with the conscious layer of mind, as it is the mind of the soul in its spiritual state of existence, as opposed to just its physical state. This layer of mind merges with the conscious layer of mind when the soul is having an earth experience. The subconscious layer of mind has all its previous experiences retained within it. When a soul is upon the earth, these previous experiences become part of the soul's current earth experience as well. And obviously next up, the earth conscious layer. The earth conscious mind. This is the mind that you are currently using and operating in. I need you to note that when I use the word ego by itself, I'm usually referring to the ego of this layer of mind. This ego is also in the subconscious mind. The mind we are currently operating through is our ego, and this layer of mind has the strongest ego of all forms of consciousness, for it is the furthest removed from God consciousness and is therefore the most separated from the mind of God. And on screen here I have the Eye of Sauron from the Lord of the Rings. As I briefly mentioned in the last series, Tolkien's work does a fantastic job of representing God and our spirituality, and one day I'll do videos about it. But the eye, not ironically, the eye represents the earth ego, and the ring is the ego. This layer of mind is the farthest removed from the source. Dense physical matter has to devolve, move very, very, very far away from the source of all energy to manifest like it does. to get their energy vibration this low and dense. Remember from the last series, I said the further away you move from God, meaning the original source, the less alike to it things appear. The further you move in consciousness from God, the less you act like God, like perfect love. This earth layer of mind is the farthest removed and the most ignorant. It is almost completely cut off from the God-conscious mind, and so cut off from the awareness of God and the knowledge of God, or the knowledge God has. This layer of mind is an animal layer, as it is the soul within physical matter as flesh, and so has the dispositions of this layer of mind and the factors that are associated with the body we're born into. It has the needs, desires, and drives of this mind, the biological instincts and makeup, which are very limiting conditions. As an example, your earth layer of mind, which perceives and experiences predominantly through its senses, cannot see or perceive everything in one, or that everything is in unity and is one. To this mind, another person is another person. They are not me. I do not feel or sense them as they do themselves, nor do they I. They think and act of their own accord, separate to my will, as do all external phenomena. The ego sees itself as separate to everything else. The ignorance brought through this limited perception brings tremendous fear, which is the opposite of love, the opposite of the origin of God. The ego is fearful because it is aware of its vulnerability, because it sees itself strictly as a single entity fighting against the threats of the universe, which is survival. The animal, so it contains the instincts for self-preservation, continuation of DNA and reproductive success and hierarchies and all the rest. And so this layer of mind loves and seeks power or control because it wants to shape, mold, and control life to the way it wants life to be and play out. Because if it can do that, it can eliminate all those threats that it fears and maximize its sense of safety, comfort, control, and pleasure. Even though it is logical truth to know it is impossible to control life in its totality to your own ego's will, the ego of the earth mind relentlessly desires and strives to be in control because of its ignorance and its fear. The ego sees self as the center of its universe and as number one in rank of most importance. And the ego is not capable of true love, which is unconditional and lovingly detached. It is only capable of sentimental love, which involves condition, which has its place, use and function, but if it's all someone is capable of, it is not possible for that person to act selflessly. Everything is based around the condition or value the ego places on it. For example, the typical ego cannot see that someone else's child is of equivalent value as one's own child. The attachment, lovingly attached, of the ego puts its own child as more valuable and important than one that is not its own, which it is not attached to. Which to do otherwise would require being lovingly detached or unconditional love. And overcoming such attachment brought by the ignorance, and to see beyond the perceptions of the ego, and to see it beyond just the intellectual level to actual realization through practice, is very, very, very difficult, but not impossible, and is what we are here to do. What is new or foreign to the soul is the earth experience. Because this is a new or foreign experience, the soul experiences it with great intensity. This great intensity is due to the presence of the conscious layer of mind, which only exists whilst living an earth life. Physical life is very intense, which is why it brings so much suffering to bear upon the soul, even if it has a relatively easy life. The conscious layer of mind, which just perceives the physical realm, sends intense messages to the subconscious layer of mind, which is a far truer mind of the soul, for it endures beyond the earth. The conscious layer of mind will react with intensity. Its emotions are intense. The subconscious layer of mind then also reacts to this intensity. The conscious layer of mind is like the actor on the movie set, and the subconscious mind is like the director, who is also involved in the performance, sometimes greatly, but remains behind the scenes. And the God-conscious layer of mind is the producer, knowing what should and shouldn't be included in the performance to create a scene worthy of production. We'll talk more about this throughout the other videos. Remember in the last series I mentioned each layer of mind has its own desire and will, has its own ego, and that one way you could describe spiritual advancement or evolution is aligning each layer's desires and wills into one or unity, or waking up the lower layers to God consciousness. Well, until this task is done, each layer of mind has its own desires and will, and they often do not align and so conflict with each other. So let's discuss the conflict between desires and wills. If you haven't watched the last series, we discuss what desire and will actually are in the second video. In every decision, at every layer of your mind, especially the most challenging decisions that you make until you're enlightened, you are given two options, two ways to act or respond. You are influenced by two opposing forces, two opposing desires that influence you. In all decisions in life, you can either choose to do goodwill, which is another word for God will, or self-will, which is ego will. Goodwill typically comes from and is the influence of the God-conscious layer of mind, which gets its knowledge of goodwill directly from God's divine ego, which is based and emerges from divine mind. Self-will comes from the ego, the sense of I, and within the human soul, it especially comes from the lower ego, although the ego is in all the layers of mind, as they each have an ego and a self-will, which must be surrendered. And the freedom of choice, and to choose which force will be given the greatest sway, is the free will. Each layer of mind has its own ego, and so each layer has its own free will to choose between self-will or goodwill. So, let's do an overview of each of these wills. First up is the one and original will, God will, or goodwill. Goodwill is the will of love. Goodwill is the will of divine purpose. Goodwill is the force which gives life its purpose. Goodwill is God consciousness in manifestation. It is the divine will which we discussed in videos 2 and 3 in the last series. It is the force which brings life, the first cause, wills potentiality into actuality, or potential energy into formed energy, powered by or incentivized by the desire of infinite potentiality to actually become something, the desire of God to know and express itself, the desire of divine love to be expressed and manifested. In order to be able to do goodwill on an individual level, a soul must have God consciousness. The higher the degree of God consciousness a soul has, the greater its ability to do God's will. God has a plan and purpose for each and every minute aspect of existence. All existence is an expression or manifestation of God, and God is the energy of creation. Through acting or choosing goodwill over self-will is what spiritually advances a soul, brings it its greater understanding of its own divine nature. Once a soul has fully realized its divine nature, it becomes as God. It is truly one with God, who is the Father, Mother, Spirit of life, which is the creative energy. When a soul has realized its divinity, God can then manifest his power through that soul, and God's power is the power of love. God is perfect, and remember what perfect means? It does not mean final ending. It means to be in a state of infinitely ever-growing possibility. This is what Goodwill or Godwill does and allows, unlike self-will, which only brings limitation, which is finite. To act in accordance with goodwill is to act in love. Act in love towards self, others, life, and God. Be one with life. Put aside self and what self would have, and instead seek to do what is best not just for self, but for others and everything in the entire universe. God's will permeates all of life, but when consciousness has evolved into a higher degree or level of intelligence, then that consciousness is able to either accept or reject God's will. God's will controls all of life and everything that is. However, God has given free will to bring about suffering. Through the overcoming of suffering through the perfection of the spirit of love, a soul is greatly advanced. The soul becomes a much more highly perfected state of consciousness. God can direct individual souls to act directly in accordance with his will, but it always remains the individual's free will choice to accept or reject such direction. God himself does not force the will of any soul. Love does not act in such a way, unlike self-will, which wants to force its will. The subconscious layer of mind contains all the thoughts, actions, and reactions that have come about as a result of the experience the soul has had in order to acquire wisdom and truth. Wisdom comes through patience and acceptance. Wisdom comes through the understanding of the nature and purpose of life. Wisdom comes through the knowledge of what self and others truly are. Wisdom comes through realizing the truth that all is God, and that God is all that is, and separate from all that is. And this is the part of the process of learning each human soul goes through that eventually leads to greatly desiring to be one with God in consciousness and to do God's will, and to rid the soul of its ignorance, falsehoods or illusions, and therefore rid themselves of fear, which is defeating and surrendering the ego to God. Free, willingly surrender the self-will. Free, willingly surrendering the ability to choose for self, removing the separation in consciousness between the soul's consciousness and God's consciousness. Which brings us to the next will. Self-will. Of course, each layer of consciousness has an ego, since consciousness is a regarded state and an awareness and a reference to an I, and therefore each layer has a self-will that needs to be surrendered. But we mostly need to focus on the lower ego, which is the strongest ego of all forms of consciousness, which is the most difficult to surrender, which is the subconscious and conscious layer of mind. Human beings upon the earth have evolved into beings, both spiritually and physically, who possess the level of intelligence or consciousness that enables them to be given the gift of self-will. This self-will separates a soul's consciousness from God consciousness and enables the soul to think and act outside the will of God. This then creates suffering. This is what is referred to in the Bible as the original sin. Original sin, which can be better interpreted as the only sin, is what separates a soul from its consciousness of God and the fact that the soul is also God in manifestation. And it is the surrender of this self-will or ego that must be and can only be free-willingly done that is the task we are here to accomplish, which brings enlightenment or reunion with God or waking up, discovering the real you, or realizing that you are God, or call it what you will. Self-will is acting, reacting, behaving, or thinking, or being contrary to divine love. Self-will is the soul's desire to be in control of life and act outside the will of God, which is the will of love, and instead force its own will. Self-will sees self as separate, whereas God's will sees all as one, yet separate. Here's some examples of the differences between the two opposing desires and wills. Self-will says, my will, whereas surrender to God's will says, the will of love. Self-will says, I would have, whereas surrender to God's will says, as you would have me do. Self-will says, I will decide what is best for me and how my life should be, and that can extend to how life in its totality should be, whereas surrender to God's will says, I place my faith and trust in you, do with me as you will. Self-will thinks love is only what pertains to self in a personal sense. Things are relative to self, some things are connected to self, others are separate. Whereas surrender to God's will thinks all of life is one. There is in highest reality no separation. Everything that exists is one. Everything that exists is God in manifestation. Everything that exists is an expression of divine energy. Absolutely everything that exists because of God's love. This is truth, so I must love all of life. And the next will, which is the troublemaker. Free will. Free will, and yes, I've used another Tolkien representation. This is Gollum or Smeagol from The Lord of the Rings, who represents free will quite well. He has been corrupted by the ring, as free will has been corrupted by the ego, and he has a split personality, refers to himself as we, and talks to himself between the personalities. Most of the other characters worry or try to keep an eye on him, as he is unpredictable and can quickly change. Sometimes he's calling Frodo Master, and being kind and doing as Frodo says, representing when the free will is choosing to follow the higher influences, or Goodwill, and at other times, he's plotting murder to take the ring for himself, so that he can be what he calls the Master, representing the free will choosing to follow the lower influences or the self-will. Free will, or freedom of will, is the ability to choose for self, i.e. self-will. Free will comes with the evolution of consciousness. When a form of consciousness has developed to a high enough degree, it will have reached a state of mind that then allows it to make choices for self as opposed to acting purely from the will of God alone. The greater the degree of individual consciousness, the greater the ego, the greater the ability to choose. Listen to what I'm about to say carefully. The ability to choose action and reaction is the foundation of free will. Not to be mistaken with the ability to control all the outcomes and happenings of life, though that is what the ego wants to be able to do. With the gift of free will comes the ability to choose for self. With the ability to choose for self comes the responsibility for the consequences of those choices. This responsibility is the basis of karma. What you reap, you must sow. How you choose to think, act, and react will determine your next set of experiences. Free will is the foundation of self-will or self-determination, and make no mistake that it is divine. It is divine because it allows for the creation of experience by choice. Choice allows for more than one possible outcome. For example, pure instinct has no choice. It will follow the set path, as would we if we hadn't separated from God's consciousness. Free will choice allows for alternative paths. Every person's life is open to choices, and every person is constantly making those choices during the course of their daily lives, often without being very aware of it. And this is the crux of free will and what some people get confused. Some people think free will is the ability to know and choose anything or everything, quickly disproven with a simple example. Think of a flower. Right now, choose one. Was the flower you thought of deadly nightshade? If so, great. But did you even consider or think of, or do you even know of the black bat flower? Was it something more common like a rose? If so, which rose? Do you even know of every type of rose there is? That along with every type of flower? Free will is choosing between known options, options that you are aware of, not all possible options, and specifically which options more so serve or are influenced by personal interest or gain versus which options that serve or are influenced by what is best overall. The more you develop or advance spiritually, the more knowledge you acquire, and with more knowledge brings more known or more options you become aware of, which brings more complexity, which brings greater influence or pull between the two opposing forces of will. For example, if you want a stumbling block that every human soul has struggled with or struggled to understand, look no further than sex. To advanced souls, or just souls that have awakened enough, casually sleeping around, as it's now called, is immoral and not in accordance with goodwill. And as far as the ideal goes, they understand marriage before sexual unity is the highest ideal. The souls that are not aware or don't know this to be a fact, who haven't developed this degree of knowledge, don't see or have any problem with sleeping around. If there is no resistance or conflict or battle through the influences of the thoughts of the wills, then there is no spiritual test, and so no spiritual ground is lost nor gained. This does not mean that the act of sleeping around itself is any different to the ideal and will of God, which is the will of divine love. It just means that this soul is not ready or even currently capable to take on this ideal or this test. Their ego is too far separate from God to even be aware that this is a problem. They are automatically and constantly failing the ideal because they are ignorant, since they are not even aware of it or don't understand enough about the reality of things or what sex actually is to even be aware of or take on the highest ideal. The more you spiritually advance, the more God conscious you become. The more complex options you become aware of. The more the free will choice requires to choose between the options between the opposing forces of will. So in the example of sex we just used, the self-will typically likes, enjoys, and desires sex. Our base animal biology and instinct is wired to it. So in such a case, the person wants sex. The God will or goodwill, once a certain threshold of God consciousness is achieved, understands the moral standards for sex, understands the ideal, the correct way to act, the correct way of being. And if a soul is ready to be put to the test, they are aware of the ideal. They can use lip service to articulate the ideal, or the conflict they're feeling. It's in the intellectual level. It now needs to become a practice in order to reach the full realization. And simultaneously, they, or their ego, strongly desires to have sex. Now the free will gets to choose. Will I uphold my highest and the highest ideal or principle and not have sex until married, even if that means I never get married and have to go my entire life without ever having sex? Or do I do what I personally, the lower ego self-will, want to do with my life and experience, and I don't want to go on or die potentially without ever having had sex or whatever the fear is? Now there is grounds for possible spiritual advancement or possible spiritual fall. The soul is aware of the options or choices across many degrees and has to choose. It can choose the highest degree of upholding this ideal, the lowest or the opposite of the ideal, or one of the varying degrees in between. The state of spiritual perfection cannot be attained without free will. The soul must learn to freely choose the way of love. The soul must learn to freely choose to be one with God in its state of consciousness. Only through freedom of choice can divine truth be realized. Without freedom of choice for self, the soul would simply be a mechanical form with no ability to create its own experiences or to respond to them in more than one way. You have free will. You are creating much of your own experiences through the way you decide to perceive, act, and react. The more willing you are to perceive a greater reality beyond the physical, the more likely you are to make spiritual progress. The more willing you are to strive to find and understand the meaning and purpose of life, the more likely you are to find it the sooner. The sooner you realize the true meaning and purpose of life, the sooner you will realize that you are God, and that you are therefore also the meaning and purpose of life. Every soul is responsible for its own attitudes and actions and reactions that come about as a result of these. No soul can blame any other soul for the way it chooses to act and react. Every soul is under equitable amounts of influence from the ego. In times of spiritual testing, every soul is free to accept or reject the influence as well as the higher positive influence. Hope that made sense and is understandable, because this is as far as I will be going in this video. To summarize and add some perspective and get things into context, consciousness is a dependent state, a condition which brings awareness and an awareness of I or self through reference, as awareness is only possible through reference, and with the awareness of I or self comes an ego. Consciousness, which is the manifest or manifestation or created manifest energy, is God understanding or being aware of God's self. It's God's consciousness, God's awareness of I, just as it is our understanding and awareness of self or I. However, there is no abiding I or self, as it is dependent upon all its many dynamic factors in order to exist. It's relative reality, as consciousness is relative reality. And this I, as well as all of manifestation, arises from the mind, or the emptiness, nothingness, the non-manifest, pure potentiality, divine love, call it what you will, which is the ultimate reality. To put into some context, mind provides options, so to say, which mind has an infinite amount of, as it is limitless potentiality and limitless possibility. Go back and watch the first series called What is God if you don't understand what I'm talking about right here. And consciousness becomes or is awareness of options mind provides, and selects from the possibilities or possible options as to which become fully manifest. And the more consciousness grows or is advanced, the more aware of mind it becomes, meaning the more options it becomes aware of. And as mind is limitless, so is the expansion of consciousness. Ever greater evolving love with ever greater manifestation of love. Same thing happens with our own consciousness as it advances and grows. And in order to advance and grow, it must break its limitations and become perfect like God. Infinite, ever-growing possibility, infinite, ever-growing love. And to do that, the ego, or I, has to be overcome or surrendered to God, or the will of God, which is a very difficult task to accomplish. To add a bit of context to this, remember in the last series I often referred to the union of mind and consciousness using marriage, as this is what marriage is and represents, and why we have marriage in human coupling. Mind proposes to life, to existence, to manifestation. The masculine proposes to the feminine, to consciousness, and the feminine, or consciousness, had to free willingly accept the proposal. Another way of saying God had to surrender its ego in order to create life, as do you need to do the same task. Like I said in the last series, you are and are going through the same process as God. Or another way of saying this is, you are a microcosm within a macrocosm. And I don't want to go off to other topics, so I'll bring it back a bit here. Part of the dynamic of factors which make up our consciousness and understanding and awareness of I or self is our layers of consciousness. And in the next video, we will be going through the creation of each layer of consciousness and the reason why this happened, which I've already hinted enough at in this video. We have 3 layers of mind and consciousness. A God conscious layer, a subconscious layer, and a conscious or earth conscious layer. Each with its own ego and desire and will. Each layer further and further removed from the original source. Each layer has goodwill or Godwill, self-will, and free will. And each layer has the task of surrendering the ego, surrendering the I or self to God, to the mind, to the emptiness, to divine love, call it what you will, and so surrender to the will of God by free willingly choosing goodwill or Godwill over self-will or ego, regardless of the cost to self. Meaning, regardless of the self or I's perception of cost or loss, the greatest good is always upheld. Choosing goodwill or Godwill brings spiritual advancement, love, knowledge, and wisdom, etc., and overcomes limitation. Choosing self-will brings spiritual downfall because it comes from fear and ignorance, and so brings further or continuous limitation. Being limited is not a perfect state. A perfect state is a state of infinitely greater possibility, which is of mind. Remember, you are going through the same process we went through in the last series. Until you have fully surrendered the ego and attained enlightenment, you are not perfect as God. You are not limitless, ever-growing possibility. You are instead more like limitless potentiality with current limited possibilities due to the limitation of the ego. The more you spiritually advance and overcome the limitations of the ego, the more your possibilities expand. And once the I, or ego, is no longer master of the soul, no longer at the very top of your value hierarchy, returns God to his rightful throne, there's a lot of ways it's been phrased, then you are as God. Each layer of consciousness must continue to free willingly choose Godwill over its self-will until it reaches a final test, which is to free willingly completely surrender the I, ego, or the self-will to God, or another way to say it, free willingly choose to sacrifice the ability to choose for self, to choose ego or self-will. In other words, free willingly choosing to lose free will, which, if successful, results in becoming one with God, or no separation in mind or consciousness from God. And the lower ego, especially the earth conscious layer, is the strongest and most difficult to surrender, and is the most difficult thing in the universe to do. It will take every fiber of your being to accomplish. And once the ego is fully surrendered, the result is, it goes by many names: enlightenment, one with God, emergence with God, one with life, God on earth, a full or complete human being, Buddhahood, Christhood, call it what you will. In the next video, we will be going right into this and discussing it in more detail. Now, hopefully, with the information you have received through these videos, you can now try and put this into practice. And yeah, it is very hard. I can't fully do it yet, but it is necessary. Start where you are. Start small if you have to. Make life better. There's always things you can do in any situation, and don't make it any worse than it needs to be. It is hard to choose goodwill over self-will, no matter what. For example, it's hard not to grab on too tightly to the reins of life to try to steer it to the way you want it to go. It's hard to fall on tough or horrible times and to look at them as learning opportunities and be grateful for the opportunity they bring, and to not become embittered or worse by them. It's hard to be humbler than the dust, as the saying says, to see yourself as servant of and not lord of the universe, to never think of yourself as more or worth more in value than anyone else, regardless of your accomplishments or their shortcomings or failures. It's hard to love someone annoying you, that alone an enemy, someone that brutally murders your child, and to not let your ego dominate, and to hold true to the higher faith and the knowledge like that all is one, nothing is by accident and under karma, to not dehumanize the person and see that the only real reason why that person did that horrible thing is because of ignorance and fear. They are dominated by the limitation of their ego, as are you, or were once. So you're just as capable of doing horrible things, and they haven't evolved or haven't chosen their self-will, over goodwill, and are actually personally suffering in hell because of it, and making life hell for others. And that they will actually someday not be as they are now and will attain enlightenment. And this is part of the learning and what's needed to get them and or you there and to forgive them. It's hard to be lovingly detached. This is what enlightened people can do. They can go through a horrible time, feel bad, express the emotions, go through the motions, and then go on. They don't attach to it. So life cannot scar them, so to say, or shake their core or their faith. They act with love no matter what. But more on all that in the next videos and others. And like most video endings nowadays, please give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell, because I'm not able to upload these videos on regular basis or regular intervals. These take considerable time to prepare, and this is not my occupation, so I can't solely commit to doing these videos. I can only commit to them in my spare time. And also share, and I don't just mean on your social media. Go out there and talk to people. Talk about these sorts of things. Friends, family, places of worship, wherever you can get the opportunity. It's fun to hear other people's opinions. And I'm always open to constructive criticism and opposing views, as should you be. I think it's the best way that we learn. And so, until the next video, or should need for me arise and call to me again, farewell, friends.